Hello and welcome. 58 years old and struggling to find a reason to exist. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded by Western nations after World War II to resist aggression and provide a military pact against the Soviet bloc. Well, now nearly 2 decades after the Cold War ended, old enemies are allies and NATO is redefining its role on the global stage. The man leading this reformation faces challenges the founders of the organization could never have predicted, such as cybercrime and energy security. To discuss how he plans to reshape NATO, we're joined by the organization's 11th Secretary General, Jaap Scheffer, who previously held the post of Foreign Minister of the Netherlands. Mr. Secretary General, very good to have you with us, and I'm glad to have a chance to talk to you about the reinvention of NATO. I'm actually going to kick off with an email because, as I said at the beginning, I'm saying struggling to find a reason to exist, and I know I saw your eyebrows raise, but I have to put an email question we got actually from Sri Lanka, from Amin Izzadin, who said NATO should have been disbanded with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The failure to do so indicates the West continues to regard Russia as a foe.
I don't agree. I can understand the question, but I do not agree. Suppose that NATO would not exist as we speak. Who would protect the Afghan people against brutality, or the people in the Balkans, or the African Union in Darfur, who are assisted by NATO in flying in and out their forces? Who would protect these people against brutality? I think nobody would do so. And secondly, do realize, I say to this email sender, that NATO, in almost all of its operations, operates under United Nations mandate.
What is the priority for the organization right now then? I mean, if the pact against aggression has essentially gone, considering the Soviet Union?
It has. I mean, the email writer is very right. The Russians, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The Russians are not a threat. They are a partner of NATO. We have a very strong partnership with the Russians. If you ask for the priorities, I mentioned protecting people against brutality. The number one priority at the moment is Afghanistan. 40,000 NATO forces trying to assist and help the government of President Karzai to get the country on its feet again after a Taliban rule, which more or less brought it back to the Middle Ages. But I say again, in other operations and missions, we have 50,000 men and women in uniform overseas. So if you say struggling to reinvent itself, I think it has been invented. It has been reinvented in the sense that it's not Europe-focused anymore, but we're also at the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan, without, by the way, having the ambition of becoming a sort of global cop, a global policeman. And the transformation process, because you need different armed forces than we had in the Cold War. You have to cooperate with other international partners, which we did not do in the Cold War, makes this transformation to a very challenging period and a very challenging exercise.
Well, you talk about Afghanistan. I'm going to put another email to you. This one came from Kano in Nigeria, and Garba Issa in Kano says, in Afghanistan, NATO is simply engaged in fighting America's war against the Taliban, thereby shaming itself and reducing itself to a glorified American regional force in the area.
If that were true, and it isn't, there would never have been a Security Council mandate for that force. And let me add that NATO forces, 40 nations almost, 26 NATO allies and 12 partners, among which the United States of America, are trying to reconstruct and rebuild that nation against a group of people who do not want to see reconstruction and nation building, who would not want to see that there are roads, that there are hospitals, that there are schools in Afghanistan, but who are beheading people, who are burning schools, who are hanging teachers from trees. Those are the kinds of people. Unfortunately, I say again, we have to fight from time to time. So this has really nothing to do with a war by anybody. It is an operation protecting people against brutality. I say it for the third time.
Well, if it's any consolation, we had an email that came in from Afghanistan, from Zamaryalai Tassal and Ali Hashmi. 2 people wrote in together. And they wrote in saying, NATO has a great and difficult job in Afghanistan. To support a better future for the people, NATO should allocate much time for reconstruction projects and talks with tribal elders across the country, including the South. On behalf of myself and the Afghan nation, thank you, Jaap Scheffer, for doing a great job in Afghanistan. So
that's great to hear, and I thank those 2 writers for their support, and I thank the Afghan people for their support, because the large majority of the Afghan people supports the NATO presence in Afghanistan. Having said that, let me make one remark in answering this question. NATO is in Afghanistan to create a climate of security and stability an umbrella of security and stability, if you wish, under which reconstruction, nation building, development can take place. But NATO is not a development cooperation organization, nor a humanitarian agency. NATO is a political military alliance which tries to do as best as it can to create that climate of security. You have to look at other organizations, the European Union, the group of rich industrial nations, the United Nations first and foremost, the Afghan government, to see that we have a coherent strategy to get Afghanistan on its feet again. And if I tell you, and those people know much better than I do, that 6 million children going to school in Afghanistan, of which 1/3 girls, that 80% of Afghans have now access to healthcare, that we have built many thousands of miles of roads and hospitals and power stations, let us not only believe what goes wrong and the explosions and the suicide attacks, let's also, and I strongly believe in this, see that we are making a lot of progress in Afghanistan for and in the interest of the Afghan people.
And you sound like the United Nations. So, you know, I'm tempted to ask, well, I will ask, what defines you, what differs you from the United Nations? I mean, I always hear this expression, supporting role, when it comes to NATO. So, you know, why not sort of basically combine the resources of NATO into what effectively are UN troops?
Now, I don't think NATO should have, it doesn't have, but I don't think it should have the ambition to become a global organization. The UN is the one and only global organization. The UN is the organization which provides legitimacy for operations and actions. The UN has its development cooperation angle, has its non-proliferation angle against the spread of weapons of mass destruction. NATO is a transatlantic alliance. The United States, Canada, and 24 continental European nations, which is a solidarity organization. An attack against one is an attack against all. NATO has been asked by these same United Nations to lead peacekeeping operations. That's what we're doing in Afghanistan. That's what we're doing in the Western Balkans, in Kosovo. NATO needs global partners to do that. Australia is very active in Afghanistan. So is Japan as a major donor. So is India. So are other smaller and bigger nations. But NATO does not have the political ambition, it should not be accepted, by the way, nor the forces, nor the money to play a global role. We should leave that to the United Nations, and that should stay and be a very clear distinction, I think.
Another email for you, sir. This came from Rome in Italy, and Dr. Ashraf Virmani says, the Taliban represent and are the people of Afghanistan. Why try to impose a Western power base on the Afghan people? The war was apparently won against Al-Qaeda, so why are they still there?
NATO is not, and the international community is not imposing anything, and we are not involved in any way in what should be and could be a political process in Afghanistan. We are protecting people. We are protecting people against those radicals, those spoilers, who do not want to see development in Afghanistan, who would not want to see progress, but who kill. Al-Qaeda, active, unfortunately, in its drive to annihilate and to destroy societies, and the radical Taliban as another instrument which does not accept a democratic development in Afghanistan. But again, NATO is not imposing anything. It is a democratically elected government, a democratically elected president, Karzai. I spoke to him 15 minutes ago, before I came to your studio. He is the one, democratically elected, with his government, with his people, who are building Afghanistan. And we are not imposing anything. And I say again, we are there with the full consent and the full approval of the Afghan government and the Afghan people. So the word impose doesn't fit, I think, there at all.
So we have a call on the line from Manchester in England. Ruben, your question for the NATO Secretary General, please.
Yes, my
Go ahead,
question
Ruben.
is that...
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is that the Secretary
Just keep going, Ruben.
NATO is legitimating NATO's presence in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I'm really doubting who mandated NATO to go to Afghanistan. If the Afghan people, by a plebiscite or any democratic vote, called NATO into their country, I'm laying that when we talk.
Ruben, let's put that to the Secretary General then. Yeah, where did the mandate come from? Ruben is asking.
The mandate Ruben is asking about comes straight from the Security Council of the United Nations. So you cannot find any fuller legitimacy for what we're doing. If there would be a plebiscite in Afghanistan, as Ruben was referring it, I'm quite sure that the large majority of the Afghan people would vote in favor of the international community and NATO to stay in Afghanistan. I'm quite sure.
So to what extent do you find yourself having to sort of clear up after the US? And I put it in these terms in that, to some degree, the situation, I mean, the cynics would say that Al-Qaeda and groups like this are fueled by a rage or an anger against UN intervention in many places, such as Iraq, such as Afghanistan, and that the US's foreign policy is creating, or at least fueling, these kind of extremists. So you're really having to deal with a byproduct or a product of a US foreign policy.
I don't think so, quite honestly, because if we go a bit back into history, we see that Al-Qaeda and others who are after the fabric of our democratic societies, that they started already long before the United States went into Iraq, long before the United States freed Afghanistan from the Taliban. But my bottom line is this. If the majority of the people supports us, if we have full legitimacy on the basis of a Security Council resolution, you must have extremely strong arguments to say what are you doing there? And do not forget that those 40,000 young boys and girls in Afghanistan also have families in Amsterdam, in Belgium, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, that many of them have come back after having paid the highest price in a coffin, that also resonates in public opinion, and that it is my job to explain to the grieving parents of such a boy coming back in a coffin that it is absolutely worthwhile that that son paid the highest price, because we are protecting and defending essential values which are essential for you and me, universal values which should be relevant all over the world, and that those young boys, 19, 20, 21 years old, pay the highest price.
We've got a call on the line. I'd like to put this one to you, sir. It's from Anwar in Paris. Anwar, what would you like to ask?
Thank you, Riz. Good to see you again. I'd like to ask Mr. Secretary General, NATO is going on beyond its mandate these days. I mean, for example, NATO is in Afghanistan these days. So does it mean someday we can see in conflict, if necessary, NATO in African country? Thank you.
That's a very good question. The first part of my answer would be that NATO is helping the African Union in Darfur. Well, we know that Darfur is horror. Hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions in refugee camps. And the Africans came to NATO, and that would have been impossible even 5 years ago had I been in front of your cameras. The African Union came to NATO and asked NATO, could you please help us to transport a battalion from Rwanda or from Ghana or from Nigeria into Darfur, and the soldiers who have been there for a certain time, could you please bring them back to their native, their home country? The African Union has now also asked NATO that if it comes to a peacekeeping operation in Somalia, to do the same. Let me make it clear, NATO is not seeking a footprint in Africa. We should not do that. We should only do things in Africa upon specific request by and of the Africans. But again, NATO is not seeking a global role. But if you look at Darfur, if you look at the hundreds of thousands of victims and the millions in the refugee camps, are you going to say to the African Union, sorry, ring the neighbor's doorbell, we are not at home? That is not the position of the Allies.
Before I get the next caller, let me ask, do you have the resources to deal with these requests that you get now?
That's difficult because it is extremely expensive, and the pressure on forces is of course very big and growing. Because it's not only NATO peacekeeping operations we are discussing. Look at the United Nations in Lebanon, or in the DRC in Congo and Africa. Or look at a possible much bigger UN, African Union peacekeeping operation in Darfur, the European Union in Chad. In other words, and the Central African Republic, in other words, the pressure on the forces is enormous. And if you say, is it difficult to keep this up financially? I say, yes, it is difficult. The NATO principle is that every nation participating in operations pays its own cost. And from time to time, I can tell you that is not easy.
And isn't paid, that's true. Sheila in London, you have a question, please.
Oh, hello. Good morning. I hope you're all fine. Nice to see you, actually. First time I'm watching this program and quite interested.
Thanks for being with us. Thank you.
I just want to say this, gentleman, he just talked about the NATO is not trying to impose anything in Afghanistan, which is completely untrue. First thing is because this is irrelevant. I can't see that he is speaking the truth. Anyway, my question is to gentlemen about two things. First of all, they're urging to Pakistani government to kill more people in northern part of Pakistan. To kill more people. This is a very important word I'm using. Kill more people. Then they will get strengthened in Afghanistan. Plus, if you see that nowadays the drugs are going. Coming from the Afghanistan.
From Afghanistan,
alone,
yeah. Sheila, because we're almost out of time, Sheila, let me put these to the Secretary General. Obviously, our caller has some views on. He thinks there's a sort of a theory, or he has a theory that there is a practice to try and I guess increase presence by destabilizing areas. It sounded like it, but also the issue of the drugs is the big one.
Let me first of all say that I take really issue with we are imposing anything. If we are imposing anything, the United Nations are imposing anything, and if the large majority of the Afghan people welcomes our presence, I really cannot agree, and I also cannot accept that we are imposing anything. We are also not inciting anybody to kill anybody. I mean, I say again, we are there to protect people, and our soldiers pay the highest price. Let's not forget that. Narcotics and drugs is a major problem. Not a prime responsibility for NATO, but it is a major problem. I agree, and we need a more effective and efficient strategy to fight narcotics and to fight drugs. And we also need to find a solution for the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is very porous and where fighters cross illegally. That means that we need a serious political dialogue with Pakistan. Pakistan is part of the solution and not part of the problem. That is our approach. That is my approach. So I take the point also of the one who questioned me and did not agree with me, that these are huge and very challenging problems. We are trying to do our best to bring a beginning of a solution.
Well, sir, we have no time left, unfortunately, and we have so many more questions. I hope you'll join us again sometime to pick up on more issues like cybercrime and these things I want to discuss. But next time, sir, it's good to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Pleasure.
And thank you for being with us. We have an interview with hip-hop star and producer Wyclef Jean next time, so please join us for that. Don't forget, any thoughts you have, send us an email to riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. Street Talk is next.